I would suggest to anybody who wants to listen that the price of, or the paper price of gold and silver both were attacked with a lot of zeal on the back of the election of Donald J. Trump on November 8th. And if you were paying attention on election night, you would note that the initial reaction to Trump being awarded the win was for the Dow Jones futures to initially soar to the tune of 800 points, and gold was up roughly $70 in the minutes after it became apparent that Trump had won. And lo and behold, the central planners that are the plunge protection team and the edifice surrounding it in America showed up for work, and the $70 up in gold was turned around and made into a $70 down, and the 800 within 24 hours, the 800 point down for the Dow was translated into a 300 or 400 point up. These were clearly and utterly the work of central planners, because we know for a fact that the volume of paper gold contracts that were sold in the 3 days following the election amounted to, let's just say, 3 times annual global mine production in gold sold in paper form in 3 short days, beginning late in the day on the 8th through to the Friday. 3 years worth of global mine supply was sold in paper form in the gold market alone. You see, this is the hallmark. This is the signature of interference and of price suppression. And what the elitists who control our system currently are paranoid of is that we get a manic takeoff in the price of metals, because the physical metals market does represent a challenge to this, the supremacy of the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. So, Dave, what we've seen over the last little while is a very, very concerted attack on the paper price of precious metals, because central planners do not want metals, specifically silver and gold, assume their rightful mantle as money, which they are, by the way, whether they're suppressed or not. They will always be the go-to and the true expression of desire for the world's population as money. And isn't it interesting, in light of this severe suppressive action being taken by the monetary elites, and it's been more than just the straight paper markets that have been affected, because they've also been trying to work over very hard the organic demand for physical precious metal with actions that have been taken in India. And let me just frame up the Indian situation a little bit here, because the head of the Reserve Bank of India is a chap with a last name Rajan, and Mr. Rajan is the vice chairman of an institution called the Bank for International Settlements, which is headquartered in Basel, Switzerland. And the Bank for International Settlements is often referred to as the central bank for central banks, in that global central bank policies are typically coordinated through the Bank for International Settlements and implemented from that point. So the attacks that we've been seeing on metals have been global in nature, and not just limited to the paper markets in both New York and in London. New York on the COMEX exchange, and London on the London Bullion Market, London Bullion Market Association, LBMA. What the experiment that they've been working with, or that they tried to implement in India, was they effectively outlawed 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, which the old notes constituted something close to 90% of all currency in circulation in India. And people should realize that or would do well to realize that the gold market in India is a cash market, and it's a physical market where people exchange banknotes for physical coins and or bars and or jewelry. And by outlawing 90% of the float of fiat currency in the country, I mean, what they did is they created chaos, but they were clearly trying to dampen demand and the trade for physical metal by outlawing the old currency. And when they outlawed the old currency, they tried to give a backstory that the old currency was readily exchangeable for new currency. But the problem was they didn't have enough of the new currency printed and on hand to allow people to do one-for-one exchanges, and they rationed the new currency. So what they in effect did was say to people, you can bring your old currency to the bank and deposit it, but then we will only allow you to extract it something like to the equivalent of $60 a day. And so this way basically they made or created artificial scarcity of currency in the country. And what they were trying to do was dampen demand, or dampen the amount of takeoff of physical gold bullion. And interestingly, it would seem by most accounts that I've read that was a complete and utter failure. And if anything, gold consumption is up in India. And as a corollary to that story, while these concerted attacks by officialdom have been occurring on paper metal and physical metal, paper metal in the case of the two exchanges I mentioned formerly, and on the physical side in India, we have seen a dramatic, and I mean a very dramatic, rise in the price of Bitcoin, which is a cryptocurrency, but which some people, and in particular the Chinese, see as a viable alternative to fiat money. So isn't it interesting that you can suppress so many things, but suppressing, and I find this very, very interesting and very ironic at the same time, because physical metal is being suppressed, but yet because physical metal, let's just say it this way, Dave, on an exchange, the people buying and selling on an exchange in paper, gold, and silver, they can't tell the difference between a physical ounce and a paper ounce, because they all get sort of mixed into the same, call it a slurry. But you go to the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and you cannot sell a Bitcoin unless you own a Bitcoin. There is no futures market for Bitcoin. There is no optionality in Bitcoin. If you want to buy a Bitcoin, you need to create an account, and then you need to pay with fiat money. And to sell a Bitcoin, you must have a Bitcoin. You cannot sell Bitcoin you do not own. And isn't it interesting that when something pops its head up with any kind of a possibility of being an alternative, how its price takes off in a real market where there isn't interference, where there isn't suppression. And anyway, I found this as a very, very interesting thing because, like, our global capital markets are a very complex place with a lot of moving parts at the same time. But there are pictures that emerge from what is occurring if you have your wits about you and if you're paying attention. So, and anyway, I don't say this as an endorsement of Bitcoin. I don't say it as an endorsement or a rejection of anything. All I'm saying is, isn't it interesting that when you have a forum where basically free market conditions prevail, isn't it interesting what happens in a free market? Yeah, alternatives can rise in price dramatically, but in controlled markets, it's not allowed.
That is very interesting how when the central bankers, they're not really touching it, getting involved in it, because we know the precious metals market from Deutsche Bank, UBS, and HSBC, we know that, you know, they were manipulating it, most likely goes all the way to the top of where the central banks are, manipulating the precious metals market. When they're not touching it, when they're not controlling it, it's amazing how it does take off.
But Dave, and listen, I have to interject here because there's another point, another big point to be made here.
Okay.
I mean, precious metal price suppression begins and ends with American banks. Why has not one American bank been named in this precious metals rigging case? That's a question, and I'd like someone to answer it. Somebody from officialdom, because you see, precious metals are all about the U.S. dollar, and the ringleader in precious metals price suppression is the U.S. Treasury itself, and namely the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is a secretive arm of the U.S. Treasury that's engaged in everything and anything and operates above all laws. And they use as their agents the broker for the Exchange Stabilization Fund is the New York Federal Reserve Trading Desk. And the New York Federal Reserve Trading Desk, acting as broker for the Exchange Stabilization Fund, disseminates their orders to the commercial banks, the big derivatives houses in New York. And anybody who does not believe that J.P. Morgan is the biggest trader in precious metal on the planet, has their head somewhere where the sun doesn't shine. And two or three of the other largest players in the world in the same are Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and Citibank. And Bank of America too, for that matter. And the notion that other banks of other nationalities would be engaged in something that the American banks wouldn't be is a dog that just doesn't hunt.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I believe that this goes throughout the American banks and all the way up to the central banks. I don't think this is just, the HSBC. It's not just Deutsche Bank. I think it's much more widespread than what they're letting us know and what they found out at this point.
Well, the big thing is, the question you have to ask is, I think in Latin they say qui bono, who benefits? Who benefits from a suppressed metals price? Well, the biggest beneficiaries of suppressed metals are the owners of the current world reserve currency, which is America and the US dollar. So anything that would be this vital to the American dollar and U.S. national interest, you don't think that there would be a huge American bank front and center in all of this? The proposition is ridiculous to begin with, that anyone even would entertain having such a discussion.
Now, you mentioned India, about how they were banning the 500 and 1,000 rupee. We also see Greece right now. They're doing what's called a soft cash ban. And we're seeing a lot of these countries do this, where they're trying to, take away the idea of using cash. And it looks like Greece right now, they're telling their taxpayers that you have to spend a certain amount only using plastic, the debit card or whatever. You cannot use cash. And if you don't do what we say, you're penalized. And we're starting to see this spread throughout different countries. Do you think they're taking these countries and using them as test beds to see how the cashless society will work?
Oh, absolutely, they are, Dave. And I mean, what they won't admit, but what they are in fact doing, is they are trying to institute currency regimes or currency schemes where every transaction can be tracked, and basically where transactions in undesirable things can be either eliminated or curtailed. And if you see, when you're doing business in cash bills, your transactions are quite anonymous, because you can exchange, a wad of bills for, maybe a gold coin or two or three. And, the government has no way of tracking where the gold is and who owns it. But if they can get everybody onto a digital platform where every transaction is cataloged and can be basically assigned a number, then they know who has what and at what price they paid for, and this way they can control trade. I mean, that's what they want. But this has always been a wet dream of the New World Order or the globalists, where they want to have a one world currency. Ideally, it would be a digital currency, and one which would allow them to track and catalog and surveil everything that everyone does, period. And this is a dream of theirs. And to which end or to what point they're going to be able to achieve this, I would say the jury is still out on all that.
So do you think their plans right now are kind of shaken up because of Trump being now elected as the president of the United States? You think things are not going the way they want? Because we see Trump out there, we see the stock market moving up, and it's just amazing how at the end of Obama's presidency, their statistical numbers, unemployment, GDP, I mean, that all looks fantastic. The stock market is approaching 20,000 points. Are they doing this as a last hurrah to say, look what I've done over the last 8 years. Look at the economy. It's incredible. And then they're going to hand it off to Trump, and, whatever policies he puts into place and whatever they do, maybe they'll crash the economy at the time while he takes office. They'll just blame everything on him.
Well, my gut tells me, it's not even my gut. What my eyes are telling me, because of what I'm reading and what I am seeing in front of me, there has been an enormous attempt to delegitimize the victory of Trump and the presidency of Trump before he ever gets sworn into office. We have seen this illustrated through the claims that Russia was responsible for basically altering the vote to get him into office to begin with. That's a complete and utter slap in the face to his presidency. The other things that we've been made aware of, like in the last week, is record amounts of legislation for a lame duck president that Obama has been furiously signing legislation over the last few weeks, effectively trying to create roadblocks for Trump and to protect and perpetuate his legacy. And I mean, this is the extent to which this is being done. It's even been reported in the dinosaur media, who hate Trump, as unprecedented. So, great lengths have been taken to delegitimize Trump. Frankly, I think Trump is in mortal danger still. He has not been sworn in, and he has an inauguration date of the 20th of January. And I frankly hope and pray that Trump's alive to assume office on that date, because I think there's absolutely a clear and present danger for him and what he stands for. You see, Trump is anti-globalist. Trump is not Trump is a free trader, and when I say free trader, I mean a real free trader, not a managed trader, not one of these people that supports these transcontinental treaties, which they call trade agreements, where signatories give up their sovereignty, and Trump is very against that. Trump is a nationalist and a populist, and I think the world needs a whole lot more of that right now. But the globalists still run the show on this planet, and they do view, no doubt, they view Trump as a complete danger.
Do you think Trump does have the ability to turn everything around, or do you think the globalists are going to stop him at every turn?
I don't think the globalists will ever give up. But I feel that Trump has the ability to, if not derail their plans, let's just say maybe set them back 50, 75 years. Yeah, he's a complete and utter spanner in the gears of where the world was headed and would have been headed under the presidency of Hillary Clinton.
Now, last time we spoke about the petrodollar. And we can see out in Syria, we see out in the Middle East with all these different countries where the U.S. is losing in this area. Russia and the Syrian government, they're pushing the paid mercenaries that the United States government were using in Syria. They're not gaining ground anymore. They're actually losing ground. And the whole idea to, prop up the petrodollar, it looks like it's coming to an end. Do you see this as coming to an end? Do you think the petrodollar is at its end stage?
I think that the petrodollar's days are limited. I think the U.S. currency and America has had a huge run at the top of the heap, and I do believe that there is a natural changing of the guard that's going to unfold, if nothing more than the manner in which the world's reserve currency, the dollar, has been managed by the stewards, the people in charge. They've been extremely reckless. They've printed way too many dollars. There are way too many dollar obligations in the world, and for people who are of the opinion that there's too many dollars in the world, or there's not enough, and there are people who believe that there are not enough dollars in the world, and I mean, they make the argument on the back of basically when the dollar is a debt-based currency. And dollars are created through the issuance of debt. And when debt is issued, not enough new money is created to pay the interest on the on the newly created money to actually allow for the repayment of principal plus interest. And that in math terms, that can create big issues. At some point, when the amount of money in existence, it's interesting because it's a sort of a mathematical formula where when you create money with interest, you can have a growth rate of a very, very, very smooth, very gently sloping up to the right curve. And then at some point, depending on time and depending on cap rate, where the amount of money in existence inflects and has to grow vertical. And we're on that part of the curve now where the amount of money basically is growing vertically. Whether the Fed is acknowledging that they're printing or doing QE, to me is irrelevant, because when looking at money supply, you have to, at least in my view, you have to take into consideration that you can't look at one central bank like the Fed in isolation, because the central banks are all connected through cross-currency swap arrangements where the Bank of Japan can do the printing, and then they can swap their yen for dollars with the Fed. And the European Central Bank has similar agreements with both the Bank of Japan and the Fed, where the European Central Bank can create the money. They can then swap their euros that they've created out of thin air for dollars. So the notion that there's never enough dollars in existence because the Fed isn't directly printing them, to me is a non-starter, because other central banks have the ability to create effectively unlimited amounts of US dollars, just as the Fed can. And the other thing I would suggest to people, you might want to pay attention to the notion that even in the mainstream, we've heard in the last year that there have been record foreign sales of U.S. government debt. Well, you see, when you have record foreign sales of U.S. government debt, that is not a vote of confidence in the dollar. So you have to start asking yourself, why has the dollar risen when countries around the world are liquidating U.S. dollar obligations? And because there's something there that doesn't jive, it's a red flag. And if the other thing we have to ask ourselves, if the Fed isn't conducting, and they are not officially conducting, any quantitative easing or asset buying programs, who's buying all this debt that all the foreign countries around the world are liquidating? Because America's biggest financiers, interestingly and historically, China has and Japan have been huge financiers of American largesse. But I find it absolutely monstrously, incredibly interesting that the third largest holder of U.S. government securities in a reserve account at I think the number is $260 billion worth of U.S. government securities is the Bank of Ireland. And the Ireland as a country has a GDP of like 240 billion, so they've got more reserves than more than 100% of their GDP they hold in U.S. dollar reserves in the reserve account. And I mean, Ireland's a country of 6 million people, and I'm even saying, look, I'm in Canada, and in Canada we have 36 million people, and we have a $2.5 trillion economy, and like we only have $80 billion worth of U.S. reserves. Like the Bank of Canada only has 80 billion in U.S. dollars in the reserve account. Like, why and how does the Bank of Ireland have that kind of dollar reserve? You see, and I'm going to answer my own question, or what I'm posing is I don't believe it's really the Bank of Ireland that owns all those securities. I believe that the Federal Reserve has an account at the Bank of Ireland, and they buy the securities in the name of or with the cover of the Bank of Ireland, but they have an account there, and this is the way they can do QE via stealth without declaring it. And I mean, and then you'd say, well, hey, wouldn't that be illegal? And then I'd say to you, well, don't forget, the Federal Reserve is not federal, no more federal than Federal Express. And I think most of the listeners would be attuned with that and know that the Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. They're just a company. And there is a law on the books in America. It was passed in 1934, and it allows the designates of the president in the United States in the name of national security to allow companies not to report their true financial condition and in fact keep what amounts to 2 sets of books. So These laws are on the books in America, and there's absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever that these things have not been in play in the last 6 or 8 years, since 2008. Absolutely, they've been in play. So, and then it really becomes a question of how much have they been in play, and who has been issued the passes, and who is it who hasn't had to report the true financial condition at certain times. And I could think of probably 3, 4, or 5 names in the American financial universe that have probably been granted a waiver where they haven't had to report their true financial condition, because it only makes sense. I guess because there's no other way, Dave. You see, if you've got a 10-piece puzzle and you put it on the table, there's only so many ways 10 pieces can fit together. And when you arrange them into and here's the other thing, you put enough pieces of the puzzle together, Dave, and you know what the picture is, even though you haven't snapped the last few pieces in. And I'll just tell you something. We're not living in Kansas anymore, and our global financial edifice is in a very precarious position right now. And that all blows back to why I've long been an advocate of owning physical precious metal, not paper. And I would be an advocate of owning physical precious metal over any cryptocurrency as well, because I do believe in the case of cryptocurrencies, I do believe that there's a thing called an internet kill switch. And if you have your wealth all tied up in something crypto, if the internet goes dark, where are you? So anyway, it just takes me back to the notion that you've gotta own, for financial insurance purposes and to protect yourself, you need physical precious metal. So there you go.
Rob, looking forward into 2017, do you believe that the central bankers, they will actually bring the economy down under Trump if he is in office? How do you think this is all going to play out?
I wouldn't put it past the elites, the globalists, and the globalists. The globalists are basically a banking syndicate, and if they get their feathers ruffled enough, yeah, I could see them creating economic misery for everybody, in hopes that people will demand Trump be removed. And this may be what they have in store for Mr. Trump. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. I think there are some wild cards still, in that they have to be a little bit careful in terms of how much they would allow the economy to tank, because when things get real nasty, things like revolution and like nobody's safe, nobody benefits from a world in chaos, complete chaos. And the globalists have always wanted to have the upper hand and have control. And so they might be well advised to be careful if they have it in mind to bring the U.S. economy down to its knees. They might get a little more than they wished for. But I think we're in for a very, very, very tumultuous, and we're living in interesting times. That's for sure. But very interesting year, I think, in